From inside the Banner offices along the Inner Harbor, it is the Banner Baseball Show. Pual Mancano, and by the grace of God and a grande vanilla latte, Kyle Goon. Kyle, thanks so much for joining me. Danielle Allentuck has phone issues. I don't want to make you seem like you were the backup plan.
Just every other day, you make me seem like the backup plan.
You're always plan A in my mind. We are going to be talking about the Baltimore Orioles, about Grayson Rodriguez's injury, how that impacts the Orioles rotation, about a new deal the Orioles made with a minor league deal with an infielder. And we'll talk about Kobe Mayo's struggles to start the season. And of course, Jackson Holliday's terrific resurgence. But first, I do promise on this show that if you write us a good review, I will read out the review. And that's what I'm here to do. On Apple Podcasts, got a couple good reviews from the Caprese. Says, I love this show for all my O's content, and Paul is a rock star. Kyle, how does it feel to hear that?
How does it feel to hear you're a rock star? Oh, it's great. Yeah.
From Hanley D says, most insightful O's podcast. Paul shows so much knowledge and insight into the Baltimore Orioles. He has very practical, level-headed discussions.
Are you trying to convince me, or are you trying to convince them?
I feel like I'm trying to convince myself that I'm good at this. Write us a good review on Apple Podcasts, and I will read it out here on the show. If I make the promise, write something nice about Kyle. He looks great with his Everyone Watches Women's Sports shirt. Looks great.
Just still on an Olympic high. So let's keep it going through the weekend, right?
We closing ceremonies are like 3 days away. So
yeah,
let's keep it going. All right, Kyle. What has happened most recently with the Baltimore Orioles? Well, they got a feel-good win last night in Toronto. Things seems like on a nightly basis have the potential to turn dire for this team, and we see a lot of people, fatalists on Twitter, go crazy for every little decision that Brandon Hyde has to make and every little mistake that this team makes. However, that was a feel-good win. It was a big win in terms of what it showed that the lineup was able to bounce back. Anthony Santander continuing to show that he is, as Mike Elias called him, the heart and soul of this lineup, hitting 2 home runs, making a great play in right field. He's barreling towards free agency, but Kyle, he's just one of the most valuable players on this team. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. Especially on a roster that's as beat up as the Orioles are right now, and down the bats that they have right now, for Anthony Santander to kind of keep making the impact he's making for a winning team. I think a lot of us have assumed that the Orioles are gonna maybe let him walk in free agency because of how historically the club has dealt with big contracts in the past. I do wonder if there is a decision to be made there, if they actually will do that, if they actually want to bring him back, because he has a lot of value. And obviously this team has a ton of outfielder depth, especially at the corners. But when he changes games the way he does, set a new career high yesterday in home runs, and there's still 2 months of the season, or however many months of the season there is left. It really says something about how he performs for a good team. And during the rebuild, I don't know if you could have projected that, but Anthony Santander is that kind of player.
Yeah, 34 home runs so far, hits from both sides of the plate, plays solid defense in right field. Those kind of guys make money in free agency, and he's going to get money from somebody. I just don't know if it's going to be the Orioles, but they certainly have more of a need in the outfield than they did 2 weeks ago after trading Kyle Stowers, who's gotten off to a rough start in Miami. But, he could have been a piece of your outfield going forward. You're going to have Cedric Mullins hitting free agency in a year's time. You traded Austin Hayes at the deadline. So there's certainly more of a need in this outfield, and every lineup could use power, especially this one. It's hard to find guys who are hit 40 home run guys, and he's on track to pass that.
Yeah. And this lineup has been so home run dependent.
Yeah.
You look at how they hit with runners in scoring position, they're just sort of average, but at home runs, they're top of the charts, and literally no one has contributed more to that than Anthony Santander.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk about the pitching staff right now, because another pitching injury has hit the rotation, and that's Grayson Rodriguez, headed to the IL with a right lat / teres. Is that the correct pronunciation? Discomfort. I don't know where that. I couldn't point to it.
I'm not a biologist.
Discomfort in the lat teres area. That is what the Orioles are saying. He was warming up for his last start on Tuesday. clearly said, I don't feel right. The Masson cameras caught him saying that, mouthing that, and does not make that start. Orioles have to use Albert Suarez in a pinch, who performed fine. Brandon Hyde said yesterday it's a mild strain, and they're optimistic about the time frame. It's concerning anytime you have a lat injury because that's a big muscle. It is hugely important for pitchers. Grayson Rodriguez 2 years ago missed significant time with this similar injury. The hope is that this is a much more mild strain than what he had 2 years ago because he missed 2 to 3 months. He was about to make his big league debut in June 2022, and then he goes on the IL in Norfolk with that. Maybe would have been his last start in AAA, and then is not able to make his big league debut that year. Comes back at the very end of the year for a couple starts, but only for AAA, and it wasn't until the following season. So that would be disastrous if he misses 2 to 3 months, because then we're talking about the playoffs. So the hope is you can get him back in time for the playoffs, and at least, I mean, would it be asking too much to have him back with a couple weeks to go so that you can ramp him up right before the start of the playoffs and right at the end of the regular season?
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about what's ideal, obviously that's what you want. You don't want him to go in cold and be like, okay, Grayson, you're a big boy, make your first start in 2 months in the playoffs in a do or die series, and especially given what happened last year and how that went kind of south. So yeah, I mean, he's just, I don't know what this pitching staff did to piss off the baseball gods. It's uncanny, and I think it's reached a level where, I know we're going to talk about this, but it's really hard to plan for if you're the Orioles. I mean, losing Kyle Bradish and Grayson Rodriguez, two guys who are two of the best young pitchers in the game. I don't know what you say, and it's really unfortunate, and I think it's going to hurt the Orioles a lot, even though they did trade for starter depth. I mean, the starters that they got just do not have the upside of Grayson Rodriguez, and you hope he finds a way to battle and warrior it out in the next month or so. Yeah,
not many pitchers in baseball have that combination of youth, of stuff, of
just hard throwing.
Yeah.
I mean, his gas, I mean, touching 98, 99, it's tough. I mean, it's tough to get a starter with that kind of velocity, and you just hope for the best, because he would be, we've talked about this so many times, he would be the number 2 starter in a playoff series, and if you lose your number 2 and number 3 in the same year, it's kind of impossible to see how you progress to a significant place in the playoffs.
No team, no pitching staff is able to withstand that. You lost Bradish, like you mentioned, for the season. You lost Means, who's probably your number 4 starter for the season. You lost Tyler Wells, who was a nice depth starter for you as well. And now Grayson Rodriguez hits the IL. No pitching staff in baseball is meant to withstand that many injuries. And it is unfortunate, the timing. Again, I had this conversation last week when Jordan Westberg went to the IL, that it happened after the trade deadline. We've talked about, Mike Elias has talked about the possibility of MLB pushing back the trade deadline. They used to have the waiver trade deadline, which was at the end of August, which let a lot more teams have more of a sample size, say, all right, we're not competing, we're going to sell some guys off for a lower price a month from now. They don't have that anymore, so they can't make trades at this point the rest of the way. It's what we saw last year with Felix Bautista. The Orioles lost their closer after the deadline. That hampered them in the playoffs, obviously, or down the stretch. So it's so unfortunate that this happens now, because you don't have a way to add to that rotation via trade. And there's nobody obviously out there that you can sign that is going to make a meaningful impact for you.
It's tough, because I feel that, I mean, every team wants to know, okay, they want the most runway to know what we're doing now is the right way. But I do think it is good for baseball to have this deadline where, teams have to make a decision.
Right.
3/5 of the way through. It's like, are we competing? Are we going for it? And that's actually kind of fun, I think, for fans. But yeah, like, hindsight is 20/20 on that. And the Orioles, because they're a contending team, they do want to know what it is. But then again, I mean, if the trade deadline was, say, August 15th, I mean, teams would be driving up the prices right now. It's like, okay,
right.
What do you got? You got Basayo, you got Mayo, like, what do you got? And so that would be this. It would be the same conversation we were having at the other trade deadline, and only the Orioles' position is much more dire.
It would be kind of madness if it was up to, that's what Major League Baseball obviously and other leagues are hoping to avoid by having a trade deadline, is you don't want to see guys, big time players, change teams at the very last minute or only for the postseason. Guys that haven't been there the whole time just suddenly join a big league team. We did see last year the Angels go for it at the deadline, then immediately go down the tubes, then DFA all of their high-priced veterans, and that created a scramble on the waiver wire. Guardians were able to pick up some of those guys. We saw Lucas Giolito was one of the biggest names moved. I don't think that's going to happen again. That was a very rare instance, and also the Orioles are so far down on the waiver wire because of their winning record that they wouldn't be able to get those guys anyway. But this team right now, these are dire times, like you said, Kyle. Chase McDermott has a scapula stress reaction in his throwing shoulder. And Mike Elias said on 105.7 The Fan the other day that he is out of our depth picture for now because they got to see what they have there, what kind of the level of injury there. You have Albert Suarez, who's still throwing at 34 years old. The good news is with Albert Suarez, he did throw 162 innings in the KBO last year, so it's not like you're going to blow him out in theory. But they have Mike Elias' own admission. He said they've kind of jerked him around between the bullpen and the rotation. If there's one guy to do it with, it's going to be your 34-year-old that you don't have a whole lot invested in. So Albert Suarez is going to be your short-term situation, but you do not want Albert Suarez starting a playoff game, obviously.
Yeah, but again, I mean, what can be done?
Right.
It's tough. What can be done?
The question is what can be done and what has been done already as well, because you wonder if, I think it's a fair question to ask if Mike Elias did enough at the trade deadline for pitching. He couldn't have seen this injury to Grayson Rodriguez come a couple days, a week after the trade deadline, but they did add to that pitching staff. They added Zach Eflin. They added Trevor Rogers. So far in the second half, the pitching has not been very good for the O's. 4.83 team ERA. That's 25th in baseball. A lot of teams, first off, that's a small sample size, and a lot of teams are struggling. The Yankees are just one spot ahead of them. But you do wonder if Elias did enough at the deadline to acquire pitching depth. I think this team still has an okay 4 in the playoffs, even if you miss Grayson Rodriguez, and knock on wood, hopefully he'll be back. But between, Corbin Burns and Zach Eflin would probably be your game 2 starter at that point. Then you're talking about Trevor Rogers and Dean Kramer. I mean, that you have 4 major league pitchers. Those are 4. You have an ace at the top. I mean, you have an ace at the top. I think that's a solid number 2 in Zach Eflin. Yeah. But then it's a drop off. So you have, in theory, the ability to get to a playoff series. But you look at what the Orioles did at the deadline, Kyle, getting Zach Eflin, getting Trevor Rogers. 2 guys who are controllable for next year. And I think that was a huge selling point for Mike Elias to get both those guys.
Right.
Do you think the Orioles did enough now with the benefit of hindsight?
Listen, I know I sort of criticized Mike Elias after the trade deadline. I don't think it's worth criticizing him for this because no one saw Grayson Rodriguez getting hurt. That being said, I'm going to bring up something that I did bring up in that column, which I got killed for.
On the BaltimoreBanner.com, where you can subscribe $1 for 6 months.
If they had gotten Blake Snell, who threw a no-hitter since the deadline, it just feels like that would have been a move that would have been like, you know what? We are going for it. We are getting the elite left-hander. And I actually don't think that it would have cost them a huge prospect just because the risk with Blake Snell was money. I mean, he's guaranteed for what, $38 million next year, which is a huge number. And I get that. And maybe the Orioles felt like they weren't in position to pay that. But I just thought that would have been a potential move where you get a World Series starter guy who was really, really good in the playoffs a couple of years ago. And you show, hey, we mean freaking business. I understand why they didn't do it. And obviously in hindsight, it looks like that might have been a big move. You could have been told that Grayson Rodriguez is going to go down. I think the Orioles are obviously money conscious, and I think they're also conscious of, Corbin Burns is a number 1 and Grayson Rodriguez is a number 2 and Zach Eflin is a number 3. And I think they're very concerned with that slotting of having guys on the roster that fit in a very particular slot. So if you bring in a guy like Blake Snell, who's that bump? And I think they get really, you know, set in the way of thinking of a roster that way.
The other thing with Blake Snell is because he wasn't moved, we don't have a deal to compare it to.
Right.
If we look at the return, if he had been moved to a different team, we could have said, the Orioles could have matched that. But in this instance, because he wasn't moved, we don't know exactly what the Giants were asking for.
Right. And now he's having a great rest of the year and the number 4 team in the NL West.
Right.
And it's sort of like, well, I mean, could you have done it? Well, and I understand. I mean, people reported that they had the conversations. I could see a world in which you don't have to give away one of your top 3, which everyone was concerned about. You say, hey, we'll take on more money.
Right.
But that's not something the Orioles have been traditionally willing to take on either.
Yeah, I mean, that everybody praised the Orioles for getting Zach Eflin, who is due $18 million next year.
Right.
$38 million is a lot more than $18 million. I think it's a player option for Blake Snell next year, but you have to assume, and in any instance, that he's going to cash that in. And I think there's another option for 2026. That's a lot of money, and for a guy that, for all of his incredible heights in his career, did struggle to start the season. A lot with that was due to the fact that he wasn't with a team in spring training. He was signed super late in the process, and he hit the IL at one point. But there was some level of concern in getting a guy who has not been steady the entire year. So you understand that. You also can look back, I think, at what the Rangers did last year, because they were entering the trade deadline in a playoff position, but they were hurting in terms of their pitching staff at that point. Jacob deGrom was out. He only made 6 starts for them. He was their major free agent acquisition. They basically rebuilt their rotation at the deadline. They got Max Scherzer from the Mets. They got Jordan Montgomery, and they went into the playoffs with a much, much better rotation that the Orioles ran into in the ALDS. They built depth upon depth upon depth. And at the time, it might have looked like overkill, but how many times have we said you can never have enough pitchers? You can never have enough starting pitchers. That was a big reason why the Rangers were able to beat the Orioles in the playoffs. And if it comes down to it again, you could say maybe the Orioles didn't build enough depth where they needed to in that rotation.
Yeah. But again, the difference between those moves and what the Orioles did, and you could argue the Orioles did remake their rotation,
right,
even though Trevor Rogers is not a caliber of those pitchers you just mentioned. But Texas Rangers were willing to spend money.
Yeah.
They were willing to spend capital, and obviously their situation with ownership is different, their market is different, huge market. But that's the difference. And at some point, even though the Orioles are adding payroll, it's not a crazy ambitious add of payroll. At some point, that's just gonna come up.
Right.
It just will, and they're gonna have to make a decision. I mean, maybe even as soon as we were talking about Tony Santander, maybe even as soon as this offseason was like, hey, do you want Santander back or not? He's a great player for you. You can replace him with that outfield depth, but he's gonna hit more than 40 home runs this year.
Right.
So it's just something that they're gonna have to confront sooner or later. And they didn't do it this trade deadline in the way that I think they're gonna need to win a World Series, but it'll come up.
Right. And that was a huge selling point last year. Why the Mets wanted to deal Max Scherzer was because of the amount of money that he was due on the rest of his contract. And they gave the Rangers a good amount of money to take him off their hands, but the Rangers are paying him a lot of money this year, and he's missed significant time.
Right.
And we knew that was a possibility. He's approaching 40 years old. He's had a lot of injuries over the course of his career. They were willing to do a deal with the devil in order to, to get a tiny sample size and a playoff performance out of Max Scherzer. And they probably don't win that World Series without Scherzer and Montgomery.
And the banners hang forever. I mean, they're not having the year they want this year, but the banner's going to hang forever.
You do that every time if it gets you those two guys. But those guys, like you said, Rogers and Eflin, I think Eflin is a playoff caliber starter. I think he's good enough to start game 3.
And he's been really
series.
Good for the Orioles.
Yeah.
He's been, I really like that deal. I mean, I kind of felt that, because I criticized the Orioles, it didn't come across how much I like that deal and how aggressive they were. And I really appreciate when we see that out of Mike Elias, who's so conservative, who's so safe, who manages the talent so prudently, jumping out and getting Zach Eflin, I think was a winning move in a vacuum.
Right. And and you add in the deal for Rodgers, because I think it was an underpay for Eflin. And I think it was an overpay for Rodgers. But if you look at it as a 5-for-2 deal, where it's Matthew Etzel, Mac Horvath, Jackson Baumeister, Kyle Stowers, and Connor Norby for Trevor Rodgers and Zach Eflin, that's fine. So, you balance the good with the bad.
Right.
But there wasn't a pitcher of the caliber of Jordan Montgomery or Max Scherzer really available, with the exception of Blake Snell at this deadline,
who did not move.
Yeah. It was Jack Flaherty, who we all saw how that worked out. The Orioles probably were right not to do that deal.
Anyone who was talking themselves into maybe Jack Flaherty works out this time, like, there's statistics and there's how baseball works. There's how teams work and how human beings work. That just could never have happened.
No, but also I do think it speaks to how few options there were on the deadline that we were having to have that conversation.
Yeah.
Because there were just so few pitchers like that were truly available.
Well, it was just like, oh, they need a profile of a guy like Jack Flaherty. Could it be Jack Flaherty? It's like, you watch the first installment, right? Yeah. It's like, no one asked for the sequel. No one asked for the sequel. I mean, there's like, personalities do matter. And I'm sure the Orioles had that all locked in whatever way they monitor that. But I knew, like,
it was not going to happen.
No way.
No, it was not going to happen. All right. Let's talk about Jackson Holliday, because that is the title of this YouTube video. I feel like we should eventually, get around to that. Jackson Holliday looks like a completely different player this time around. His first stint in the big leagues did not go according to plan. 2 for 34. We all saw his struggles. Now we are seeing the real Jackson Holliday. This is the version of Jackson Holliday that has been billed to us as the top prospect in baseball. He's 20 years old. He hit his first home run in the big leagues on Sunday, grand slam onto Utah Street. Then he hit another one Tuesday, and he hit one last night. So that's 3 homers in the last 3 games. He has been phenomenal. And this is the version of Jackson Holliday that we were expecting to see the first time. But also, this is so normal and so natural for somebody who is a rookie, let alone 20 years old, to have more success in his second big league stint than his first.
Yeah, and it's been funny. I monitor Orioles chatter, fan chatter in various ways.
Not good for your mental health.
No, not very good. And you can tell who's been paying attention to the minors and who hasn't, because when Jackson came up and he immediately struggled at the gate, people were like, oh, he's supposed to be this, he's supposed to be that, and why is he doing this? Like, and then at the trade deadline, there were people, and I looked on Facebook. Danielle told me, I know how old you are because you looked on Facebook. It's like, oh, people should trade Jackson Holliday. He's not going to be anything. It's like, just buckle in. This guy is good. This guy has been good at every level, and more so than being good at every level, he's believed that he's going to be good at every level. He has a confidence that is hard to project in a statistical way.
Yeah,
that it's not brashness, it's just, oh, I belong here.
Yep.
And he really has belonged at every level. And I know he had that first struggle in the first 2 weeks of his major league career, but if you look at every O's prospect that's come up in the last 5 years, that's what's happened, right? So I just think, we are seeing the guy that he's been projected to be. I'm not surprised. Glad he worked out whatever was going on with his swing and his approach to the plate. But he's just looked a lot better, and I'm glad people are finally getting a chance to see what he can do at the major league level, because I've believed it for a year and a half at least.
Yeah, and with the exception of a couple missteps in both his first stint and his second stint in the field, he's a great defender. I mean, he is a natural shortstop, which means he has elite range at second base. He made a terrific throw yesterday, waited on a ground ball, and then fired it to first on a throw that looked like it was about 95 miles an hour. He's got a great arm. He checks every box. There's a reason he was billed as a 5-tool prospect when he was taken out of high school, and so far he's doing that. He may not have the power potential of Gunnar Henderson. Not many players do, but he's going to hit for average. He's going to make great plays in the field. He's going to do it all.
We're also talking about he may not have the power potential. He just hit 3 home runs in a
he
row.
did. Yeah,
Like,
true.
I mean, come on.
Yeah.
Like he's good.
Yeah.
He's good. He's going to be good.
He's
good.
He's fine, everybody. Somebody else who I think will be perfectly fine. Now, he's not the same caliber prospect as Jackson Holliday, but he is a top 15 prospect according to MLB Pipeline. Kobe Mayo has come up, and he's 0 for 13 with 8 Ks and just 2 walks in his first handful of games in the big leagues. He will be fine. If we've learned anything from Adley Rutschman, from Gunnar Henderson, from now Jackson Holliday, from Colton Cowser last year, give these guys time. I know a lot of people immediately jump to, well, he's not ready, send him back down. He's 22. I get that. He's very young. He is going to be just fine. The bat will turn around. It's a major, major jump. It's like jumping 2 levels, going from AAA to the big leagues. He's going to be perfectly fine. The only concerns are going to be defensively, and he has looked slightly out of step there at third. Orioles expected that. I think everybody who's watched him in the minor leagues, he had close to 20 errors at third base and first base in AAA this year. Everybody has expected there's going to be a learning curve defensively. Offensively, I have no concerns whatsoever.
Yeah, and this is a guy who just knows how to hit.
Yeah.
It is interesting. Just I'm wondering what the difference in the Orioles' approach will be. I mean, Jackson, when he came up in April, was sort of a luxury, right? I mean, he's sort of like, not that they had any second basemen who were hitting well, because they didn't, but he's sort of brought up as like, hey, we're winning. We're hitting, but like, let's see how Jackson Holliday does, because we're not getting the production we want on second. Now with Jordan Westburg out for, the Orioles kind of don't have a lot of depth there. So I'm kind of wondering, I think if, we win another week and Kobe Mayo is still hitting this way, this is a classic case where they'd send him down and they'd be like, okay, finish out the season in Norfolk, tighten this. Now we know what your swing looks like, what your approach looks like. I think he's chasing a bit, but I don't know. I don't know what they're going to do, because Jordan Westburg is out and they just need power from the right-handed side. And so it's going to be interesting. And I think, ultimately the decision their hand was forced, but the decision to bring up Kobe Mayo is going to be more consequential than the decision to first bring up Jackson Holliday was.
Right. Somebody who has given them a little bit of power from that right side. Hasn't hit a home run yet, but he's got 8 hits in his first 16 at-bats, including 2 doubles. Eloy Jimenez. I'm not quite ready, but I'm getting close to the territory of chalk this one up for another Michael ISW and another Paul L. I didn't get the trade at the time. I didn't fully understand them trying to get something out of somebody who hadn't shown a whole lot in several years, has been hampered a lot by injuries last several years. You looked at the reaction of Chicago White Sox broadcasters and fans when he was dealt to Baltimore, publicly getting down on their knees and thanking Mike Elias for taking Eloy Jimenez off their hands. Boy, does that look bad in hindsight.
I just want to add one detail here. It's a slight aside, because I did a column this week on Larry Sheets, whose kid Gavin is on the White Sox and just went through a 21-game losing streak. And I brought up the broadcast thing. I was like, well, they're hammering them every day. And it's bad in Chicago, because Larry Sheets, who goes and watches Chicago White Sox games and watches his kid get hammered by the White Sox broadcast, said, I actually don't think it's that unfair. It's like, they're roasting my kid, but it's not a good team.
Right.
So things are bad in Chicago. But I say that to bring up this point. Chicago just fired their manager. They just lost 21 straight games. Sometimes it's as simple as a scenery change. It's as simple as a Chicago White Sox have all-time record low vibes to go with their terrible results. And Brandon Hyde has this history with Eloy, brings him in, believes in him, says, hey, go out and hit, just go. That's all you have to do. You don't have to play the field. Probably less injury risk from all the injuries he's been through in the last few years. Go out and hit. I believe in you. And sometimes that's all a guy needs. And certainly this early surge is really promising. As ever, I think the trade is really going to be about, okay, is he an October guy?
Right.
And is he producing in October? And we'll need to see that. But good early returns from Eloy Jimenez.
He's just being asked to do a very simple thing. Like you said, go out there, DH, pinch hit against left-handed pitchers. It was just an untenuous untenable situation.
Untenable.
There it is. Situation in Chicago. He just had so much baggage because he came up and he looked so great in his first year. He earns that contract.
I mean, look at Jazz Chisholm in New York,
Right?
Having a hero's welcome.
Yeah.
I mean, these scene changes going from a terrible team, like bad future every day. You're showing up at the ballpark, like, how are we going to lose today? And then you go to a team's like, all right, like come out there and deliver for us to win. Like you actually might be playing for something. That is such a mentality difference, especially for elite athletes.
Yeah, and all of the things that I think you could point to when he was in Chicago and they were losing, that fans got under fans' skin, are now look like this guy's a vibes king. It looks like this guy now has always had great vibes. He's always bringing a smile to the ballpark because
that's what people say about me on this staff.
This is exactly right. If nothing else, vibes king, Kyle Goon. But it's the biggest knock on him in Chicago was health. And he is not being asked to play every day, and he's not being asked to play in the field here. So that is the way to keep him healthy in theory. We'll see if his health holds up over the last, 8 weeks of the season. But it should, in theory, be able to keep him healthy and to keep him fresher. And if you can do that, then maybe you can get more out of that bat and get him closer to where he was a few years ago. All right, one more thing that we have to touch on, and that's the Orioles signing J.D. Davis, who's 31-year-old infielder, to a minor league deal. He's an Elias guy, drafted by Houston in 2014 in the third round. Has played 8 seasons, 2 with Houston, 3.5 with the Mets, a season and a half with the Giants. Started the season with Oakland, dealt to the Yankees for cash and Jordan Groshans in June. Released by the Yankees on August 2nd, and now is an Oriole. His stats are not great. 218 average, 4 homers so far this season, negative 0.5 WAR. But look, if we've seen anything from the Orioles over the last couple of weeks, it's that don't write off the guys who have negative WAR. Eloy Jimenez, Austin Slater being called upon in very minor roles. I don't know if we'll see J.D. Davis in the big league soon or even at all, but it is crazy, Kyle, how quickly things change. The minor league depth for this Orioles team, the Norfolk depth that seemed like an influx, seemed like this team was flush with infielders. They had to get rid of them. They didn't know what to do with these guys. They had, I look back on July 27th, their Norfolk lineup had Jackson Holliday, Kobe Mayo, Kyle Stowers, Billy Cook as their top 4 hitters in that lineup. The Norfolk lineup on Tuesday, top 4 hitters were Taron Vavra, Daniel Johnson, Nico Goodrum, and Nick Maton. How quickly things change.
They're the same picture. No, they're not. Yeah, and I think it was interesting. John Mioli was messaging us and saying, "Let this be a lesson." Every time we said that, the Orioles got to trade their depth. The Orioles got to trade their depth.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's high points and low points, and this is a low point in the depth. But I still think there's a good part to it, because even though a lot is resting on Kobe Mayo and his production and what he can do, I just think if you know the future, if you know those guys are the future of your infield, let the future begin.
Yeah.
Get going with Jackson, get going with Kobe, and I ultimately think it's, even though it's a necessity thing and JD is brought in as a necessity piece, I think it's a good thing. Either way, I mean, their postseason hopes are being hurt by injuries in other parts of the field, and so let's just get going on the future.
Yeah, it is crazy. I think in a couple weeks, right before the end of the regular season, the way this is lining up, it feels like the often memed scene from Avengers Endgame, where all of the portals open up and everybody comes back out. Because you're talking about, if everything works out, if you are able to get these guys back right before the playoffs, at the end of the regular season, you're looking at adding Danny Coulomb back to that bullpen, Jorge Mateo, Grayson Rodriguez, hopefully even sooner than that. You could be adding all of these guys back into the fold. If Jordan Westberg, hopefully right before the end of the regular season.
That would be huge. I tend to just have doubt. And this is just me. This is not about the Orioles, but just when teams project, oh, so-and-so is going to be back in 2 weeks, I think, okay, 2 more weeks. I kind of doubled the time in my head. And I think for a lot of those,
I think you're scarred by your Lakers run. That's what I think it is.
Maybe, but I think for a lot of those, you've really got to just, and I'm sure the Orioles are thinking it that way. You got to think, well, what if they don't?
Right.
And
what if
Coulomb would be great? Grayson obviously is almost a necessity. I think Jordan Westbrook is a necessity. So those would be the 3 that I would really target.
Yeah.
But we'll see. I would guess, if I had to guess now, I think we're looking at probably 1 or 2 of those 3 back in time.
Yeah. And what if they come back and they're not themselves? You know, that there's a reason that these guys go on minor league rehab assignments, and it's to get their timing back. It's to get their repertoire back. They have to have a runway. You can't just throw them into a playoff game. So we'll see.
It might happen, though.
It might have to happen. We have more time to figure that out. And Brandon Hyde and Michael Elias do as well. And you have more time to catch up on everything that you need to know about the Orioles on the BaltimoreBanner.com. $1 for 6 months is how you can subscribe. And to read all of Kyle's work, Danielle Allentuck's work. Hopefully she's getting a new phone as we speak. Andy Koska, who's on the road right now. John Mioli, who writes an awesome newsletter as well. Got great stuff there. And of course, subscribe to the Banner Baseball Show. Write us a good review. Give us a like. Give us a thumbs up.